I never thought I would see smoke curling from my bedroom at midnight. The stench of burning plastic and the shriek of my husband's voice slammed me awake. Rushing down the hall, I froze in the doorway. Two bodies tangled in the sheets, thrashing and howling, begging for help. On the nightstand, a small silver tube gleamed under the lamp, but it wasn't the brand of lubricant my husband had sworn he kept hidden, for us only. My hand trembled as I held the identical tube I had secretly swapped days before. The difference was invisible, until now. Instead of oil, it was industrial-strength adhesive, sticky and merciless. The firefighters burst in seconds later, their axes glinting. One shouted, "Don't move them! The glue will tear their skin!" My husband sobbed, his mistress wailed, and the room filled with the choking smell of singed fabric as they struggled to separate. And I, standing in the doorway with the evidence clutched in my palm, asked myself, had I just gone too far? Or was this the only way to expose the truth? You've just heard the beginning of a story that shocked even the firefighters who witnessed it. Betrayal, anger, and a desperate act collided in a single night, and the scars left behind were far deeper than the burns on the sheets. But this isn't just about glue or about revenge. It's about how far trust can be pushed before it finally snaps. Where are you listening from? Share your thoughts below. I'll choose one comment to inspire next week's story. When people hear this story, their first reaction is usually disbelief. They imagine I must be reckless, cruel, or unhinged, but that isn't the truth. My name is Clara Johnson. I'm 36 years old, and until recently I thought of myself as a quiet, ordinary woman. I worked as a librarian in a mid-sized town outside of Portland. My days were filled with the scent of old paper, the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, and the routine of cataloging returns. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed tabloid headline. But marriages don't collapse in silence. They crack slowly, like plaster splintering behind fresh paint, until one day the damage can't be hidden anymore. My husband, Daniel Johnson, was 39 and worked as a regional sales manager for a home improvement company. Outwardly, he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who wore pressed shirts and knew how to fix a leaking faucet without calling a plumber. To neighbors, he was charming. To me, he was once the boy I met in college. The boy who made me laugh so hard in the cafeteria that soup spilled from my spoon. We married young, and for years I believed we were building something durable. We bought a modest 2-story house on Birch Lane, mortgaged at $260,000, and saved carefully. Every month, I tracked the payments, making sure we stayed ahead. Our combined savings account grew to nearly $80,000, earmarked for renovations and maybe, someday, children. Yet somewhere between the job promotions, late-night conferences, and his sudden taste for boutique gyms, Daniel shifted. He carried new cologne on his skin, sharp, musky, too expensive for the man who once balked at paying more than $20 for a bottle. He stayed late, texting under the covers, his screen angled away. At first, I told myself it was stress, that he needed space. But space turned into distance, and distance turned into secrets. Then came Melissa Hart. She was 28, a blonde fitness instructor who taught at the very gym Daniel had insisted on joining. I met her once at a community fair. Her handshake was firm, her smile wide, her perfume citrusy and overwhelming. I didn't know then that she would unravel my marriage stitch by stitch. I was not blind, though I pretended to be. The receipts told stories. Hotel charges in downtown Portland, room service for two, bar tabs far beyond what Daniel usually spent. Evidence piled up in drawers, in my purse, on the kitchen counter. I cataloged them the way I handled books, organized, dated, logged. But what ate at me wasn't just the betrayal. It was the waste. 10 years of savings, of scrimping, of saying no to vacations so we could patch the roof or replace the furnace. Each dollar felt stolen, funneled into cocktails and luxury sheets for someone else. I should have confronted him sooner. Instead, I watched and waited and told myself I was gathering proof. Because in my heart, I wanted not just to accuse, I wanted to expose. I remember the night I found the first undeniable clue. The house was quiet. The only sound the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock in the kitchen. Daniel had fallen asleep at the office, or so he claimed. But when I did the laundry, his khakis held a hotel receipt crumpled in the pocket. Room 417 at the Hilton. A date stamped 3 weeks earlier. That receipt became evidence number 1 in my private archive. I slid it into a manila folder beneath our tax papers, my fingers shaking. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though Daniel hadn't smoked in years. I pressed the folded slip flat, imagining the scene it described. Melissa in silk sheets, Daniel lying, me alone in our bed. After that, I saw everything differently. The glow of his phone in the dark became a spotlight of betrayal. The hush in his voice during late-night calls turned sinister. Even the faint scent of soap on his skin felt foreign, like he had scrubbed away someone else's touch before coming home. Still, I stayed. Why? Because leaving meant unraveling 15 years of my life. We had equity in the house, shared accounts, family photographs framed on the staircase wall. I told myself I needed certainty, proof so strong that even he could not deny it. So I began to plan. Not loudly, not rashly, but with a calm precision I didn't know I possessed. I tracked dates, cross-referenced times, even drove past the gym to see if his car was parked there when he swore he was meeting clients. And then, in the middle of my quiet investigation, the idea struck me. What if the confrontation didn't come from my words, but from reality itself? Daniel had a private drawer where he kept personal items. He believed I never touched it, but I had. Inside were small bottles, a silver tube of lubricant, and receipts for purchases he insisted were for our intimacy. He was careless, forgetting that a librarian notices details others overlook. That night, as the rain lashed against the windows and the house smelled of damp leaves, I stood in our bathroom holding 2 identical tubes. One was his lube. The other was industrial adhesive I'd picked up under the guise of a craft project. Their packaging was near identical, silver casing, similar fonts. The only difference was a tiny code near the base. I hesitated, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked unfamiliar, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep, lips pressed tight. But beneath the exhaustion was a clarity I had never felt before. I wasn't doing this to harm him, I told myself. I was doing this to reveal him. When the swap was done, I placed the substituted tube neatly back in his drawer. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew it was a gamble. I knew it could spiral into something far beyond my control. But what I didn't know then was just how far the truth would reach, how many lives would burn before the glue cooled. The first sign that my quiet act of revenge had detonated came faster than I ever imagined. 3 nights after I had swapped the tubes in Daniel's drawer, He announced he was heading to a late sales dinner. His shirt was freshly pressed. The faint scent of musky cologne lingered as he buttoned his cuffs. To anyone else, he looked like a husband providing for his family. To me, every gesture screamed deception. I watched him from the front porch as his car headlights swept down the damp street, raindrops glimmering under the lamps. The neighborhood smelled of wet grass and asphalt, a sharp reminder that fall had set in. My fingers dug into the wooden railing until tiny splinters pressed my skin. I whispered to myself, "This is the night. Tonight, the truth will surface." Hours dragged. The clock's ticking grew louder, the refrigerator's hum thundered in my ears. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred, each page smelling faintly of dust and ink, reminders of the library where order reigned, unlike my marriage. At midnight, the landline rang. Few people had that number anymore. "This is Officer Ramirez," a stern voice said. "Your husband has been involved in an incident. We need you to come to Birchwood Apartments immediately." My stomach twisted. Birchwood was not a steakhouse or hotel ballroom. It was an upscale apartment complex notorious for its short-term rentals. My suspicions were confirmed with one address. I threw on a coat, barely registering the cold drizzle as I sped through slick streets, wipers squealing against the windshield. The scene exploded before me, red and blue lights flashing, sirens pulsing in the night air. Neighbors leaned from balconies, their faces glowing eerily under emergency lights. The acrid scent of smoke and chemicals mixed with wet asphalt. I pushed through the crowd until a firefighter blocked my path. Inside the apartment, a voice bellowed, "Don't move them! The glue is tearing their skin!" Daniel's cry pierced through the open window, ragged and panicked. "Please help us!" And then I saw them. My husband and Melissa, carried awkwardly in a blanket, their bodies twisted together like unwilling sculptures. Melissa's hair clung to her sweaty face, her perfume mingling with the sharp stench of solvent. Daniel avoided my gaze, his face pale with shame. A paramedic shoved a clear evidence bag into an officer's hands. My heart stuttered. Inside lay the silver tube, smeared, unmistakable, the one I had placed in his drawer. The officer turned to me. "Ma'am, do you have any idea how this could have happened?" Industrial adhesive was inside what appears to be a lubricant container. For a moment, the world slowed. I tasted metal on my tongue, my heart battering my ribs. Confess and risk everything, stay silent, and watch the fire burn. Daniel's eyes flicked to mine, desperate, pleading, silently begging me to save him. He spoke first. "Clara, please. You have to help me explain. It was just a mistake." I almost laughed. The bitter sound cracked in my throat. A mistake? The wrong hotel? The wrong woman? Or just the wrong tube? Melissa whimpered, clutching the blanket. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Firefighters sprayed solvent, the harsh chemical smell burning my nose, peeling paint from the air itself. I stepped back, shadows cloaking me, the damp night seeping into my shoes. I had orchestrated this every second, every choice, and now the truth was naked before us all. Yet, as the scene unfolded, unease prickled down my spine. Because exposing Daniel was one thing, living with the fallout was something else entirely. The adhesive had bound more than skin. It had bound me to a consequence I couldn't yet see. And that was only the beginning. The following morning, the entire house smelled faintly of chemicals, a lingering trace from Daniel's frantic late-night attempt to wash away the evidence. I had heard the washing machine groaning at 2 in the morning, its cycle dragging on, soap and water colliding with fibers steeped in guilt. When I rose from bed, the laundry room was humid, the air thick with the scent of bleach. Daniel had slumped against the counter, his shirt half-buttoned, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He didn't know I had been watching. He didn't realize every move etched itself deeper into the record of his betrayal. I thought I would feel satisfied after last night, the sirens, the neighbors whispering, the sight of him carried out in shame. Yet victory felt strangely hollow. My coffee tasted bitter, my stomach churned, and even the ticking of the kitchen clock scraped my nerves raw. Had I gone too far? Had I crossed a line no one should cross? Before I could drown in doubt, a knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find Mrs. Ellison, our sharp-eyed neighbor, standing with her cane. She had been widowed for years, her gaze sharper than any detective's, her perfume a strong waft of lilacs that seemed out of place in the damp morning air. "Clara, dear," she murmured, voice dripping with both concern and curiosity. Her eyes darted toward the house. "Everyone saw the fire truck last night. Half the street has been whispering. Are you all right?" I forced my lips into something resembling a smile. "I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding." But she lingered, her brows knitting together. "Well, misunderstandings don't usually come with flashing lights and firefighters, and then this showed up in my mailbox this morning." From her handbag, she pulled an unmarked envelope. Inside lay a photograph, grainy but damning. My heart froze as I studied it. Daniel and Melissa slipping into Birchwood Apartments. Her arm looped through his, her head tilted toward him in an unmistakable gesture of intimacy. The timestamp stamped the truth. It was days before the glue incident, proof this was no isolated mistake. Evidence number 2. My pulse roared in my ears. Someone else had been watching them, someone who wanted me to know. But who? A jealous rival? A private investigator? Or maybe another betrayed spouse keeping score? "Who gave this to you?" I whispered, clutching the photograph. Mrs. Ellison shook her head. "No return address. No note. Just dropped in my box. I thought you should see it." I thanked her, closed the door, and leaned against it, the paper shaking in my hand. My chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. My plan had been dangerous enough, but now there was another hand in this game. At noon, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, pretending everything was normal. He cracked eggs into a skillet, poured tea, and unfolded the newspaper with fingers that trembled at the edges. His attempt at calm was laughable. I slid the photograph onto the table between us. The color drained from his face. He pushed the chair back with a screech. "Where did you get this?" "That's not the question," I said evenly. My voice surprised me with its calm. "The question is, how many times did you sneak into that building with her?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound, the faint crackle of eggs burning in the pan. Daniel's lips trembled as he struggled to form words. His hands hovered above the photograph like it might ignite if he touched it. Finally, he stammered, "It's not what you think, Clara. She was helping me with fitness routines." "Fitness routines?" My laugh sliced the air like glass. "At midnight? At an apartment rented by the hour, with wine glasses in the trash? Do you really expect me to swallow that?" He pressed his palms to his face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. The kettle hissed behind me, steam clouding the air, filling the room with a metallic scent. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my tone to remain steady. How far did you mean it to go, Daniel? 1 night? 2? Enough nights to risk our mortgage, our savings, my sanity? His chair scraped against the tiles as he stood abruptly. You don't understand. She listens to me. She makes me feel alive again. You've been so distant, so cold. The word stung, sharper than I expected. Cold. That was his excuse? My nights spent alone cataloging every receipt, every hidden text, reduced to frigidity. I stepped closer, the photograph still clutched in my hand. I was distant because you made me doubt myself. Every late meeting, every unexplained receipt, it wasn't me withdrawing, Daniel. It was me bracing for the truth you refused to speak. He shook his head violently, as if denial could erase the evidence lying between us. Clara, please, if this gets out, my job, my reputation, everything will be ruined. That's your fear? I whispered. Not my heart, not our marriage, just your reputation. He flinched, but said nothing. His silence screamed louder than words. I turned away, gripping the counter as the room spun. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower droned, the mundane sound colliding with the chaos unraveling in my kitchen. For a fleeting moment, I wished I could rewind to a time when the loudest argument we had was about whether to buy generic cereal, but that world was gone. In its place stood this broken man and the woman who had stolen him. And now a faceless figure was feeding me photographs, tightening the noose around his lies. I lifted the picture once more, studying the timestamp. It was precise. 8:43 p.m., 3 days before the firefighters stormed Birchwood. My mind raced. Whoever had captured this wasn't random. They knew his schedule, his patterns. Daniel, I asked, my voice low, dangerous, who else knows about Melissa? Who else have you led into this spiral? He swallowed hard. No one. It was just us. But I didn't believe him. The photograph was proof enough. Someone was tracking him, and now they had pulled me into their game. As Daniel slumped back into his chair, muttering excuses I refused to hear, a thought gnawed at me. Maybe my swap of the tubes hadn't been the first move in this story. Maybe I was just another piece on someone else's chessboard, and that terrifying possibility lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. What if the real danger wasn't Daniel's affair at all, but the hidden hand that wanted me to know about it? The envelope with the photograph haunted me all night. I laid it on my nightstand, unable to slip it back into the drawer. Under the lamplight, Melissa's grin mocked me, Daniel's posture screamed betrayal, and the timestamp glared like a wound I couldn't close. Sleep came in broken fragments, every creak of the house pulling me back to the image. By morning, I had resolved to find out who sent it. If there was a hidden hand in this story, I needed to expose it before it controlled me completely. I started by calling the Birchwood Apartments manager. My voice trembled as I introduced myself, claiming to be a tenant inquiring about security footage procedures. The manager, polite but brisk, explained that all footage was archived digitally, accessible only to law enforcement or hired investigators. My skin prickled. Someone had either broken the rules or been granted access. Later that day, while shelving books at the library, I noticed a man lingering near the circulation desk. He was tall, early 40s, his trench coat damp from the drizzle outside. He didn't borrow a book. didn't ask a question, just watched. His eyes were sharp, the kind of gaze that cataloged everything. When I glanced up, he offered a faint nod, then walked out, the bell over the door chiming in his wake. I told myself it was nothing, just a stranger. But when I left at closing, the same man stood across the street, cigarette glowing between his fingers. My heart hammered as I slid into my car. By the time I started the engine, he had vanished into the shadows. The next morning, another envelope appeared. No return address, no handwriting, just my name typed neatly across the front. Inside was not a photo this time, but a hotel invoice, evidence number 3 in my growing collection. Charges for champagne, late checkout fees, and spa services, all billed to Daniel's company card. The dates stretched back months. I felt sick. How much of our savings had evaporated while he pampered Melissa in hotel suites? Each line item mocked me. $340 for champagne, $200 for wellness massage, $80 for valet parking. Our careful savings, nearly $80,000, was being siphoned for affairs dressed up as luxuries. That night, I confronted Daniel again. He sat at the dining table, flipping through his phone with a blank stare. I dropped the invoice in front of him, the paper slapping against the wood. "Another fitness routine?" I asked, my voice icy. He flinched. "Clara, where are you getting these? Who's feeding you this garbage?" I crossed my arms. That's what I'd like to know. Someone has been watching you. Someone knows every move you've made. His eyes darted nervously. "You don't understand. If you knew the truth—" "What truth?" I pressed. He shoved the invoice back toward me. "This isn't about Melissa. It's bigger than her. Bigger than us." The words chilled me. Bigger than us. What could be bigger than a husband betraying his wife, torching their savings, and destroying 15 years of trust? But the way he spoke, the desperation in his tone, made me pause. Because what if he wasn't just lying to me? What if he was hiding something far darker than an affair? Daniel's words echoed long after he spoke them. It's bigger than us. They rang in my ears like a bell I couldn't silence. For weeks, I had thought Melissa was the whole story, an affair, a betrayal, a humiliation I had uncovered with my own hands. But now he was hinting at something else, something hidden in the shadows. I pressed him, my nails biting into my palms. What could possibly be bigger than destroying our marriage? Tell me. He shook his head violently. I can't. If I talk, we'll both be in danger. Danger? The word landed like a shard of ice in my chest. He wasn't making excuses. His eyes darted, his breathing quickened, as though he truly feared someone might be listening. "Daniel," I whispered, leaning closer. "Who are you protecting? Melissa?" His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A new message lit the screen. I caught only a glimpse before he snatched it away. "Stop talking." The room tilted. He clutched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, then shoved it into his pocket and rose from the table. "You don't understand," he muttered. "This isn't safe." And then he walked out, leaving me shaking with fury and fear. That night, unable to sleep, I sat in the living room staring at the shadows thrown by the streetlights. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth drifting in through a cracked window. I replayed every odd detail. The envelopes arriving without explanation, the stranger at the library, the threatening text on Daniel's phone. Was Melissa just a cover for something worse? Or had Daniel fallen into a trap far larger than his own infidelity? The next day, determined to dig deeper, I drove to Birchwood Apartments. I parked across the street, camera in hand, and waited. The building's facade gleamed with mirrored glass, reflecting the overcast sky. Hours passed. Finally, a sleek black sedan pulled into the lot. Melissa stepped out, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, but she wasn't alone. The man from the library, the one in the trench coat, walked beside her. My chest constricted. He wasn't just some passerby, he was connected to Melissa, and by extension, to Daniel. I snapped a photo, the click of the shutter muffled by the hum of traffic. Evidence, I thought. I needed proof, even if it terrified me. Later, as I drove away, another realization clawed at me. Whoever was sending me envelopes wasn't trying to protect me. They were steering me, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, into a story I didn't fully understand. When I returned home, a new envelope waited on my doorstep. Inside was a single typed sentence. He owes more than love, and the debt is due. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, as if it had been held too close to fire. My hands shook as I folded it back into the envelope. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't a random act of revenge from another betrayed spouse. This was a message, one that tied Daniel's affair to something dangerous, something that could swallow both of us whole. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't the one in control anymore. Someone else had taken the reins of this story, and they were driving us straight toward ruin. The note, "He owes more than love and the debt is due," did not leave my thoughts for a second. I folded it, unfolded it, inhaled the faint smoky scent clinging to the paper. Someone wanted me to know Daniel's secret, and it was bigger than adultery. The following morning, after he left for work, I searched. My hands trembled as I opened the filing cabinet in our study. The room smelled of dust and lemon polish, the quiet hum of the clock the only sound. For years, I had respected his private drawer, but respect had died the night firefighters carried him and Melissa into the street. Behind a stack of tax forms, I found a thick manila envelope stamped "Confidential." Inside, the third piece of evidence waited. A legal contract demanding repayment of $120,000. The words glared up at me. Final notice. Default. Collection proceedings imminent. Worse still, Melissa's name appeared on the final page as a business partner. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about sneaking around. He had signed her into our future, entwining her with our money, our house, everything we had built. When Daniel returned that evening, I met him at the door with the contract in hand. "What is this?" My voice was steel, his face drained of color. The briefcase slipped from his grip, papers scattering like snow across the entryway. "Clara, where did you find that?" "In the drawer you thought I'd never touch." My hand shook, but I held the papers high. "You lied about Melissa, about the hotels, and now you've dragged me into debt. $120,000, Daniel. Do you know what that means for us?" He staggered into the living room, running both hands through his hair. "It's not what you think. Melissa, she's connected to people I can't say no to. They pushed me, blackmailed me. If I didn't take the loan, if I didn't sign—" "You signed away our future," I cut in. My voice cracked under the weight of fury. "Do you realize what you've done? That's our house, our savings, our entire lives on these pages." He lowered his eyes, whispering, "If I don't pay them back, they'll come after us." The words froze me. Come after us. My anger collided with fear, but I didn't let him see. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hiss of wind through the window. The contract lay on the nightstand, heavy as stone. I imagined men pounding on the door, dragging away furniture, dragging me into ruin. 15 years of saving, every sacrifice, every penny, now hanging by a thread because my husband couldn't keep his vows, or his hands, away from danger. By dawn, my decision was made. I walked into the district attorney's office, the contract clutched tight. The marble floors echoed under my shoes, the air sharp with disinfectant. My throat burned as I spoke to the clerk. I want to report financial fraud. My husband is involved. The words left my mouth like a verdict, and I knew. There was no going back. The clerk's pen scratched loudly against the form, every sound magnified in the silence of the district attorney's office. My finger clutched the envelope so tightly that sweat seeped into the paper. Once I handed it over, the secret I had guarded, half in rage, half in fear, would no longer belong to me. It would belong to the state. The assistant investigator guided me into a small interview room. The walls were sterile white, the fluorescent light above buzzing with an irritating flicker. On the table sat a recorder, its red light already glowing. I felt like I was stepping into a confession booth, one where the words I spoke would shape the rest of my life. "Please state your name," the investigator said, his voice calm but firm. "Clara Johnson," I whispered. Then louder, "Clara Johnson." "And why are you here today?" My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "My husband, Daniel Johnson, has committed fraud. He borrowed $120,000 under false pretenses, tied to a woman named Melissa Hart. I believe the money connects to dangerous individuals. This," I pushed the contract across the table, my hands trembling, "is proof." The investigator leafed through the pages, his brow furrowing. He let out a long breath. "Mrs. Johnson, these aren't ordinary loans. These signatures link to shell companies we've been monitoring, organized crime. Do you realize the danger you're in?" The floor seemed to drop under me. "Danger?" I repeated. He met my eyes. "If they suspect you turn this in, you'll need protection." When I left the office, the crisp autumn air outside bit through my coat, sharper than before. Yet beneath the cold sat a strange sense of relief. I had done it. I had crossed the threshold. There would be no going back. That evening, Daniel burst through the door. His face glistened with sweat, his tie hanging loose, his eyes wild. He slammed his briefcase onto the floor, papers spilling like wounded birds. "What did you do?" I stood in the doorway, steadying myself. "I told the truth." His fists curled at his sides. He stepped closer, voice low and venomous. "Do you have any idea what you've unleashed? These people will not forgive. They will not forget." I didn't flinch. "Better to face them than keep living in your web of lies. At least now I know where I stand." He punched the wall, plaster cracking under his knuckles. The sound reverberated through the living room. For a second, I thought he might turn his rage on me. Instead, he pressed his bleeding hand to his forehead and whispered, "You've doomed us both." But deep down, I felt a fire ignite in my chest. For years, I had been the quiet wife, shelving books, ignoring warning signs, swallowing disappointment. That woman had died with the sound of sirens at Birchwood. What stood in her place was someone willing to gamble everything for truth. The decision terrified me, yet in that terror I finally felt alive. The subpoena arrived 2 weeks later. A thick envelope stamped with the county court's seal landed on our doorstep, heavy as a stone. My name and Daniel's name, glared from the front. Inside, the letter ordered us both to appear before a grand jury. When Daniel read it, the blood drained from his face. "You went too far," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You did." The day of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with the low murmur of voices. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the marble floors echoing under hurried footsteps. I wore my plain navy dress, the one I saved for funerals. Daniel wore a suit, but his tie was crooked, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. In the courtroom, Melissa sat across the aisle. Her blonde hair was slicked back, but her hands shook as she clutched her purse. And beside her, like a ghost from the shadows, stood the man in the trench coat, the one I had seen watching me at the library. He whispered something into her ear, and she nodded quickly. The prosecutor rose. "We are here today to consider charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The state calls Clara Johnson." I walked to the stand, my pulse hammering. The wooden railing was cool beneath my hands. "Mrs. Johnson," the prosecutor began, "tell us what you found." I unfolded the contract, the paper crinkling under the lights. "I discovered this document hidden in my husband's drawer. It details a loan of $120,000, signed by Daniel Johnson and Melissa Hart. The money was not used for legitimate purposes. It was hidden, misused, stolen." The defense attorney jumped up. "Objection. Speculation." The judge's gavel rapped. "Overruled. Continue." I swallowed. I also received anonymous envelopes, photographs, hotel receipts. This note. I held up the paper that read, "He owes more than love, and the debt is due." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Please remain for questioning." Daniel's attorney called him next. He shuffled to the stand, eyes downcast. His voice cracked as he answered the first questions. "Mr. Johnson, did you borrow this money?" "Yes," he admitted softly. "And did you use it for personal luxury to fund your extramarital affair?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes flicking to Melissa, then to me. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." The room erupted in murmurs. The prosecutor pressed. "Who pressured you into this?" Daniel's hands trembled. "It wasn't just me, Melissa, and the people behind her. They pushed me. I owed them." Melissa shot to her feet. "That's a lie!" she cried. The judge banged the gavel. "Order!" The prosecutor leaned forward. "Mrs. Hart, do you wish to testify?" Melissa's voice cracked. "I was told it was safe, that Daniel would handle everything. I never knew it would come to this." The trenchcoat man shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, his jaw tight. And then the prosecutor delivered the strike. "Mr. Johnson, are you aware your so-called debt is tied directly to a shell company run by this man?" He pointed toward the trenchcoat figure. Daniel's head snapped up, his mouth opened, closed. The silence stretched until finally he broke. "Yes," he whispered. The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, a flash of cameras from reporters in the back. Melissa buried her face in her hands. For the first time, I saw Daniel not as my husband, not even as a cheating man, but as a pawn, trembling before the machine that had swallowed him whole. But this was only the first half of the battle, because truth, once unleashed, doesn't stop neatly in a courtroom. It spills. It consumes. And what happened next changed everything. The courtroom buzzed like a hive struck by a stick. Reporters whispered frantically into phones. Jurors exchanged glances. And the judge's gavel slammed again and again to regain control. But control was already gone. The prosecutor stood tall. "Mr. Johnson, you've admitted the debt. You've admitted the affair. Now tell this jury, did you knowingly conspire with Melissa Hart and her associates to conceal funds and defraud your company?" Daniel's mouth worked soundlessly. His gaze darted to Melissa, then to the trenchcoat man, whose expression was ice. Daniel's voice cracked. "I didn't want to, but yes." Melissa leapt to her feet. "You coward! You dragged me into this." "And you let them use me," Daniel snapped back, his face red, veins bulging at his temple. The judge barked, "Order! Sit down, both of you." The prosecutor's voice cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, you see it clearly now. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, organized scheme. And the cost, financial and personal, has fallen on Mrs. Johnson, the innocent wife." My throat tightened. For months I had lived in suspicion and silence. Now the truth stood naked in the light of the court. The defense attorney scrambled to recover. "Your Honor, my client is under immense pressure. He has been manipulated, threatened." The prosecutor pounced. "Then let him say so plainly. Mr. Johnson, were you threatened with harm if you didn't comply?" Daniel's eyes glistened. "Yes, they said they'd ruin me, that they'd hurt Clara if I didn't cooperate." Gasps swept the room. "My stomach lurched. Hurt me," Melissa whispered. "They told me the same." The judge's gaze cut toward the trenchcoat man. "Bailiff, detain that individual for questioning." For the first time, the man shifted uneasily. His composure cracked. 2 bailiffs moved in, seizing his arms. He hissed under his breath, "You think this ends here? You have no idea." The prosecutor leaned forward. "On the contrary, it ends today." The confrontation spiraled into a storm of accusations. Daniel shouted. Melissa sobbed. The trenchcoat man cursed as he was dragged away. I sat frozen, every nerve alight. At last, the judge called for silence. "We will recess until charges are formally filed. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Hart, you are both remanded into custody pending trial." Daniel's head snapped toward me as deputies cuffed his wrists. His voice cracked across the room. "Clara, please, don't let them do this to me." I met his gaze, steady for the first time. "You did this to yourself." The deputies pulled him away. Melissa followed, her sobs echoing down the hall. The trenchcoat man disappeared behind another door, his threats still hanging in the air like smoke. When the room finally cleared, I remained seated, my hands trembling. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the scent of old paper and sweat heavy around me. The prosecutor approached quietly. "You've done something brave, Mrs. Johnson, but this isn't over. Organized crime doesn't dissolve overnight. Be cautious. We'll assign protection." I nodded, though fear clawed at my chest. For the first time, I understood the scale of the storm I had stepped into. My husband's betrayal had been just the doorway. What lay beyond was far darker, far more dangerous. But even as I walked out of that courtroom, past reporters shouting questions and flashbulbs blinding my eyes, I knew one truth with absolute certainty. I had chosen the only path left. And now, whatever came next, I would face it. The trial that followed was brutal, drawn out over 6 months, and dissected in every local newspaper. Reporters dubbed it the glue affair, though the adhesive was only the spark that revealed the rot beneath. What unraveled in court was not simply an act of infidelity, but a chain of fraud, intimidation, and betrayal that shook our quiet town. The first consequence was legal. Daniel was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud embezzlement. and conspiracy to launder money through shell companies. The judge's gavel fell hard that day, echoing in my ears as though it were striking my marriage itself. His company disowned him, stripping him of pension benefits and health coverage. In dollars and reputation, he lost everything he had tried to preserve with lies. The second consequence came from Melissa Hart. Though she painted herself as a victim, the evidence tied her to the fraudulent loans. She received a 3-year sentence, suspended in exchange for testifying against the men who orchestrated the scheme. When she spoke in court, her hands trembled, her voice thin. She admitted she had believed she was securing investments, only to realize too late that she was being used as a front. For her, reputation collapsed. Her fitness studio shuttered within weeks of the verdict. The third consequence landed on the man in the trench coat. His real name, revealed during testimony, was Victor Haldane, a mid-level operative in a crime syndicate that had been funneling dirty money through small-town businesses. His arrest, tied directly to the contract I had turned over, triggered a larger investigation. Federal agents paraded his connections across the news, seizing assets worth over $2 million. His glare haunted me, even as deputies led him away. But his threats lost their power behind iron bars. The fourth consequence was financial. But this one was mine. The debt Daniel had created still clung to my name. For weeks, I feared I would lose the house, that the life I had built brick by brick would be stripped away. But the judge ruled in my favor. The fraudulent loans were Daniel's sole responsibility, tied to his signatures and his deliberate deception. The house was declared mine, free of lien. The court awarded me full ownership and ordered restitution of $45,000 from Daniel's remaining assets. It wasn't everything I had lost, but it was enough to rebuild. The final consequence was personal. For 15 years, I had been Daniel's wife, his shadow, his partner, his quiet supporter. That identity collapsed the moment he was led away in chains. Yet in its place, something unexpected grew. The prosecutor's office offered me counseling and legal support, reminding me at every step that I had been the one to break the silence. Neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now stopped me on the street, pressing my hand, telling me I was brave. I won't pretend it was easy. Nights were still long. Sometimes I woke in a sweat, hearing Daniel's voice begging, "Clara, please don't let them do this to me." But then I remembered his lies, the contract, the way he had risked my safety for his secrets. And I reminded myself, I had chosen justice. Practical life adjusted slowly. I sold Daniel's car, closed our joint accounts, and reopened under my own name. The $45,000 restitution came months later, a check that felt less like money and more like closure. I poured it into repairs for the house, repainting walls, fixing the roof, even replacing the old carpet Daniel always said we couldn't afford to change. Every improvement was a small act of reclaiming space. Melissa sent me a letter once from the rehabilitation program she entered after sentencing. She wrote, "I never meant to hurt you. I was blinded. I hope you can forgive me." I never wrote back. Forgiveness was possible for myself, but not for her. As for Daniel, he wrote too. Long, rambling letters from prison filled with apologies and desperate claims that he still loved me. At first, I read them, hoping for some acknowledgement of the truth. But each one twisted responsibility, painting him as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own downfall. After the fifth letter, I stopped opening them. Justice, I realized, wasn't about punishment alone. It was about boundaries, about drawing a line no one could cross without consequence. The glue had exposed his betrayal, but it was the contract that sealed his fate. And in the courtroom, with the evidence spread bare, the balance finally tipped. By the end of that year, I stood on my porch as autumn leaves blew across Birch Lane. The house behind me was mine alone. The savings account was smaller, but it was clean. And for the first time, the silence inside felt peaceful, not suffocating. The story had ended with loss, yes. But it also ended with survival, and survival, I realized, was its own form of victory. When I look back now, the image that returns most vividly is not the night of sirens or the courtroom chaos. It is the quiet morning after the verdict, when sunlight spilled across my kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I felt no dread opening the mail. The stack of envelopes contained nothing more than grocery flyers and a utility bill. No threats, no anonymous photographs, no contracts meant to crush me, just the ordinariness of life restored. The story of how I swapped a tube of lubricant for glue will always sound sensational, even absurd, to those who only skim the surface. People laugh when they hear the title, imagining a petty prank gone wrong. But for me, that night was never about a joke. It was about survival, about clawing through deception, until the truth was undeniable. That act became a catalyst. It cracked open a world of lies I could no longer ignore. The first morale is this: betrayal rarely hides alone. What begins with secret texts and unfamiliar perfumes can mask deeper dangers, financial, legal, even criminal. Had I looked away, Daniel's debt might have swallowed me whole. My silence would have made me complicit in crimes I didn't commit. The glue revealed his affair, but the evidence of fraud revealed the true rot. Trust is fragile, yes, but when trust is broken, pretending blindness is not loyalty. It is surrender. The second moral is harder, one I learned with shaking hands and sleepless nights. Seeking justice often comes with a cost. Turning over that contract meant risking retaliation, public humiliation, and the permanent end of my marriage. There were nights I questioned myself, nights I asked whether I should have stayed quiet and simply walked away. But silence would not have protected me. It would have chained me to Daniel's choices forever. By choosing truth, I lost him, but I gained myself. I have spoken to other women since, women who whispered their own stories of betrayal in hushed tones at community centers, church basements, even in the library aisles. Some stayed, some left. Some still hesitate, caught between fear and denial. To them I say, do not underestimate the power of evidence. Gather it, protect it, use it. Because in the end, when emotions are twisted by manipulation, facts become the only anchor. Of course, not everyone can or should replicate my path. My act with the glue was reckless, a gamble that could have ended in tragedy. I do not glorify it. If you find yourself in danger, whether through infidelity, financial fraud, or threats, seek help through safe channels. Call a lawyer. Speak to authorities. In the United States, victims of financial fraud can contact the National Fraud Hotline, 1-866-720-5721, and those in abusive relationships can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. There are always safer roads than the one I chose. Still, I cannot regret what I did. Without that single impulsive act, the truth might never have emerged. Daniel might still be siphoning money into shell companies. Melissa might still be smiling on his arm. And I might still be drinking bitter coffee at dawn, pretending not to see. Instead, I sit here in a house that is wholly mine, walls repainted, roof repaired, a garden blooming where weeds once choked the soil. Sometimes neighbors ask, "Clara, do you miss him?" My answer is simple. I miss the man I thought he was, the boy in the cafeteria who made me laugh until soup spilled from my spoon. But that man died long before the firefighters arrived. The one who remained was a stranger, bound to debts, lies, and dangerous choices. Losing him was not the end of my life. It was the beginning of my freedom. So if you are listening to my story now, take this with you. Do not let fear of scandal or shame silence you. Do not let love blind you to evidence staring you in the face. And above all, remember that the truth once brought into light cannot be unspoken. It may hurt, it may cost, but it will also liberate. My story ends not with vengeance, but with clarity. Justice came, consequences followed, and the lesson remains. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced betrayal that forced you to make a choice you never thought you could? What did you do? Comment below and share your story. I read every reply, and sometimes I choose one to inspire the next episode. And if my tale struck a chord, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story of love, lies, and the truths that refuse to stay buried. Because in the end, no matter how messy or painful, the truth always finds a way out.